بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير وبعد. Alhamdulillah, we continue with our learning of the work Mathara al-Qulub, the Purification of the Hearts by Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud. We spent a good amount of time talking about the universal cures for the diseases of the heart and the universal ways of purifying the heart in dhikr, recitation of Quran, and reflection. We talked about constructing a regular routine of dhikr in the morning and the evening. And after that, we went to the next section in which the Shaykh talks about the nature of the suggestions and passing thoughts that occur to the human heart. We spent a couple of days talking about these different types of khawatir and the various rulings associated with them. We now move on to the next section in this work, and this section is the longest section and is the bulk of the second half of this work, Mathara al-Qulub. It is the section discussing at-tahalli. Remember, we said that the process of purification can be looked at as a process of removing the bad and then adorning with the good. These two we call at-takhalli wa tahalli. Takhalli means to get rid of, and tahalli means to adorn. So this section is about adorning the soul with the good, positive, spiritual qualities. Before the Shaykh talks about each of the various ways one may adorn their soul, he talks about the notion of the maqam, our understanding of the spiritual station and what it is. So, as we look at this, we are framing our understanding of what is to come in the subsequent readings of the text. So there's treating the illness that's covered in the first half of the book, in which he outlines the various diseases of the heart. There is this process of treating the illness by removing the filth, by cleaning the spiritual wound that is in the heart. But purging and cleaning and getting rid of the bad is not enough. More must be done. Detox is needed, but after detox, nourishment is required. When a person wishes to go on a detox, they may detoxify their bodies from certain substances. Maybe they give up sugar and grains and coffee, caffeine, and other things like that. But as they're detoxing from these things, they also need to nourish themselves, either during the detoxing period or after the detoxing period. When it's over, what are they going to consume? Something that's going to be nourishing. So if we use the human being as an analogy, when we look at the process of removing the bad and adorning with the good, we can look at what happens to a human being when he or she gets a cut, and that cut gets infected and the infection spreads. What must they do to recover from this infection from the wound? Number one, they need to clean the wound. If they have a wound, they should clean it. They should apply a general antiseptic. They should cleanse the area with some antiseptic. After they clean the wound and they apply a general antiseptic, they should bandage the wound so that it's not getting contaminated by any external pathogens or anything like that. So they now have a band-aid or some kind of bandage around the wound to allow it time to heal. And if that infection runs deep beyond the superficial area of the wound, the person may suffer fever. They may suffer inflammation in the body and other conditions. And in that case, if the infection spreads further than the area of the wound, they might need other medicines. They might need antibiotics. They might need to nourish themselves with electrolytes, with extra fluids, with vitamins, with nutrients that will help their body regain its strength and balance to fight off that illness. So you see, in the human being, we have this analogy of getting rid of the bad while also taking in what will strengthen us, which simultaneously fights the infection and strengthens us and nourishes us. So this chapter or section is about the maqam or the maqam'at, the spiritual stations, each of which describes a specific spiritual quality that the Muslim must inculcate if they're going to be purified individuals after having gotten rid of the bad qualities. So, reading from the work, the Shaykh says, after all of that, if a heart has become illuminated through the process of removing these vices, everything in the first half of the book, it cannot do without adornment. What is adornment? Adornment is the tahalli. It is nourishing the soul after detoxing the soul. He says that the person in this station has to adorn themselves. And this line of poetry is not a complete sentence, meaning the second line completes what he's saying here. So we want to read it along with the next line, which is adornment. They require adornment through maqam'at, spiritual stations. They require adornment through maqam'at or spiritual stations. However, there's no hope in achieving them until many obstacles have been overcome. So this section is about maqam'at. A maqam is a station in the Arabic language. It literally means the place of standing. We call it a station. When you are stationary, you are in a fixed position. So a maqam is a fixed position or a station. And by the word maqam, he means a few different things. The ulama say that among these maqam'at, these spiritual stations, we have some that are called maqam of tawheed, where it's a kind of witnessing of the heart, a kind of spiritual realization that is constant with the person they didn't have before. You have a maqam of certainty, which is the conviction that is the catalyst of your behavior. You have the maqam of akhlaq, the maqam of a certain character state, a certain characteristic that you take on and develop within yourself. So these are called maqam'at because they are fixed stations. They're not temporary experiences. They're not transient phenomena, things that come and go. No, a person is fixed and within a station for some time. Some of the ulama call these maqam'at manazil, or way stations along the path. So in the analogy of travel, if in the olden days before cars, if you're traveling on a beast of burden like a camel or a horse, traveling through a remote area, you would not stop in the middle of nowhere necessarily. You would stop at a way station. And this is not a way station where your items are necessarily weighed, but it is a station where you get rest. So the manazil are the way stations along the path. So when we say way station, in English it could sound like way as in weigh an object, but this is not way spelled like that. It's W-A-Y, a way station. It's a place along the path where you rest. And once you've rested there for a while, you've regained your strength, you're now ready to set out on the next part of your journey until you get to the next way station. And then you rest there until you arrive at your destination. So that's the analogy. He says through these spiritual stations, one attains adornment. However, there's no hope in achieving these stations until many obstacles have been overcome. That means that a person will not attain unto these stations along the journey until they've overcome certain obstacles. He doesn't say what the obstacles are here, but he alludes to them. Obviously, the spiritual diseases are all obstacles. And he talks about the obstacles of the nafs, as well as some of the challenges when it comes to determining the nature of the thoughts that come into our mind and heart. But generally speaking, the obstacles are 6. And these 6 were mentioned by one of the early Imams, Ibrahim ibn Adham, rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the early spiritual teachers. And he said that a person will not attain unto these stations of the Salihin until they overcome 6 general obstacles. Number 1 is hedonism, basically the excessive desire for carnal physical pleasures. That has to be overcome. A person has to come to terms with the desires of their nafs. That is an obstacle. Number 2, the obstacle of pride and self-importance. Number 3 is the obstacle of addiction to comfort and ease. People get addicted to comfort and ease, and when they are addicted to comfort and ease, they become unwilling or unable to sacrifice and make effort for something that is more important. Number 4, the 4th obstacle is laziness, somewhat similar to number 3. Obstacle number 5 is chasing after the lower world to the point that it hinders and distracts one from what is of eternal importance. And lastly, the 6th obstacle is wishful thinking or delusion, getting caught up in our own self-narrative. That self-narrative puts us as the hero, as the central figure and hero in our own movie. You go to the movie theaters, no one goes to the movie theaters anymore, but in the time of movie theaters, you go watch a movie, you have the central hero of the story, and we have our own hero narrative where we're the central hero of our story. We have to leave that theater, the darkened theater, and go out into the light to realize that no, we're not the hero of our own narrative. We have to get rid of delusion. So getting rid of delusions about ourselves and about the world around us is a very important part of the spiritual path. And it could be a very painful part as well, because we come to understand things that we thought were true are not true. Certain things we thought about ourselves realize are delusions, and we come to a greater clarity and certainty at the end of that. He says, the one who is firm and steadfast and serious in his struggle in attaining adab, he is the one who has a station. Now here Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud is telling us that the station is a fixed station, literally a station, in that it is not a temporary, transient experience that comes and goes. Because in our Islamic spirituality, we have 2 things here. We have the station, and we contrast the station with the hal. The hal is the spiritual state. It's the temporary state that comes and goes. So a station will be with a person for a while, and they have to work for it. It requires effort. It requires dedication. They make a decision to strive for that station, and Allah bestows them that station after their own acquisition thereof, their kasb. The hal, on the other hand, is a spiritual state. You don't work for it. It comes and goes. It is Allah who gives it to you without you working for it. And because it is a state, it means it is temporary. The ulama say, dawamul hali muhal. The perpetuity of a state is impossible. It's called a state because it's temporary. So the temporary cannot be other than temporary. So here he's talking about the distinction between the state and the station. He says, the one who is firm and steadfast and serious in his struggle in attaining adab, he is the one who has a station. So we have to work towards it. So looking at this dichotomy between state and station, we want to note that some stations are higher than others. And this means that you cannot move to a higher station until you have mastered the stations before it. You cannot jump the queue. You cannot skip ahead of line in the spiritual path. You cannot attain unto the highest levels of spiritual development if you have not had the stations preceding it, the basic stations. For example, the very first station is Tawbah, and that's the station he talks about after this. Tawbah. A person cannot attain to the highest stations of Rida and Tawakkul and Qana'a, trusting Allah, having contentment with the divine decree and all of these higher stations, if they have not actualized the station of Tawbah. You cannot do that. And before there is Tawakkul, there has to be contentment. And the one who does not master contentment will not have tawakkul, right? Likewise, with fear, the station of khawf, fear of Allah Ta'ala, within that single station there are multiple levels or a process of development. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So in the beginning, it is fear of Allah Ta'ala that causes one to leave the major sins. It is a fear by which, acting on that fear, the person leaves the major sins. But they may still do minor sins. So then their fear develops to where they're leaving the minor sins. And then that station of fear develops further to where they're leaving the things that are makruh, disliked. And then they may move further to leaving those things that are questionable or doubtful. They're not clearly makruh or haram, but they're somewhat doubtful, so they leave that. And in doing that, they then reach the station of Warah, of scrupulousness, which is a higher station than fear in this context. So a person can reach Warah. They abstain from excessive consumption of the halal for fear of it getting mixed with the haram. And in that, they develop the beginning stages of the station of zuhud, of otherworldliness, of non-attachment to dunya. And eventually, with that station acquired, they develop the station of qana'a, of contentment, of tawakkul, of rida, and then the higher stations. So this is how it works. So one cannot skip ahead. But at the same time, the spiritual path is not linear, where you have no share of tawakkul until you have gone through all of these. You may have states of tawakkul, states, temporary states where the action of the heart is tawakkul, but it hasn't become a fixed station where that is your spiritual norm, where you operate your life with that level of spiritual development where it's not a temporary state. So he says that the maqam, the spiritual station, consists of knowledge, a state, and a consistent action. The state is a result of knowledge. So notice how he mentions state within the aspects of a station, but it's not the station itself. He says that it consists of knowledge, state, and consistent action. The state is a result of knowledge. So the maqam, whatever it may be, the maqam of tawbah, the maqam of trust in Allah, the maqam of fear, the maqam of hope, whatever maqam it may be, it will consist of knowledge first, followed by a state, followed by an action. And they say that so looking here, knowledge, number one, state, number two, action, number three. They say that the state, number two, is occasioned by knowledge, meaning knowledge is the sabab, the cause for the state. And the action is occasioned by the state. So the state is the cause for the action. Knowledge comes first because it's the foundation, and that knowledge then brings about a certain state, and that state becomes the catalyst or the motivation behind the action. And the person continues with this. The knowledge affects their behavior, and until this becomes their fixed station. So using the analogy of a tree, the ulama say that knowledge is the foundation. And the states or ahwal are the branches of that tree, and the actions are the fruits of the tree. So the actions are the result of states, and the states are the result of knowledge. So the stations, as I mentioned just a moment ago, it's not a linear process. It's not so clear cut. A person may experience the states of the other stations, but not the stations themselves. And the stations themselves are not so stationary that you have to spend X number of years in one and then X number of years on another. Because the journey is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah elevates whomever He wills, however He wills, with or without the knowledge of this terminology, with or without the knowledge of the definitions of each of these stations and their realities. So we talk about these stations to learn about the qualities we should be developing, but we should not think to ourselves, I'm working on the station of tawbah, so I will ignore the station of tawakkul, of trusting Allah Ta'ala. No, certain things are obligatory on the level of tawakkul, but as a station where it becomes your prism through which you view reality, by which you develop yourself, you have to have other stations acquired before you get there. It doesn't mean you don't have trust in Allah Ta'ala. So all of this is from Iman in Allah Ta'ala, and all of these stations are from the branches of faith, the Shu'ab al-Iman. And when we look in our history, when we go back to the time of the Sahaba, we see that the Sahaba didn't use terms like maqam and hal. They didn't speak about it as manazil or way stations. They didn't map out this territory in the specific manner we're learning it. Nevertheless, they had realization of every single maqam of these maqam'at. So what is important is not knowing the terminology per se, but actualizing the realities described in the terminology and definitions. A person can be completely ignorant of these terms, yet they have full actualization of these spiritual realities. And a person, conversely, could know all of the terms and know all of the lingo, yet they have not actualized a single station from these stations. So we have to be aware that it's not about intellectual knowledge. Oh, I know the names of all of the manazil. This stage is followed by this one, and this stage is followed by that one, and these are the names for them, and this is what they look like. What's important is tahqiq. Tahqiq is where it becomes a reality. That is what we seek after. But the same ulama who mentioned the importance of tahqiq over the intellectual knowledge also wrote books and described the reality of these stations and taught this to their students, because it is in our intellectual tradition and spiritual tradition to know and learn these things. So we're learning about these stations, but our aim is to actualize them in our life, which means that work has to be done. The very definition of maqam is something that the person works towards, contrary to the hal, which is the temporary spiritual state that is not acquired through effort. We don't want to confuse between these two, because a person may be deluded, which is one of those obstacles in the path, by thinking that because they have experienced a temporary spiritual state, they have thereby attained that station. A person may be in a temporary state where they feel content with the decree of Allah in a given situation. They feel a certain expansion that comes to them suddenly, without even seeking it, without working towards it. And it may stay with them for a few days, and in those days they may delude themselves into thinking, I have the station of qana'ah. a very high station, maqam ali, and they think they have this station, and they don't. They have a hal, a temporary hal. Allah gave them a taste of it, but they haven't acquired the full meal, so to speak. They haven't made the effort to acquire it. And it goes away. That's the telltale sign. It goes away very quickly. Sometimes it's a day, sometimes a week, sometimes a month. So we can't delude ourselves into thinking that temporary spiritual states identify us as spiritually realized people with stations. So at the same time, we don't want to get caught up in, as some of the ulama say, obsessing over which station you're at now versus next week or next month. Some of the ulama, when they talk about these matters, they don't really discuss the maqams in a methodical way, listing them out one by one. They tell their students, listen, you need to just establish your fard, do your dhikr, stay away from the haram, do extra nawafil, and develop your relationship with Allah Ta'ala, and these maqam'at will unfold one at a time on their own without you seeking them out deliberately. And what they mean by that is the person doesn't fixate on one and ignore the rest and just work on it and it alone, where they lose sight of the forest for the trees by fixating on one and ignoring the others. It's a more holistic process. So something is very holistic like this, yet the ulama describe it in detail, listing them out one by one. So after you go through them one by one, you go back and look at them with a more panoramic vision, a more bird's eye view, and try to live your life actualizing and seeking them all. And one by one, you'll find that you develop each of them over time with Allah's aid. So this is the introduction to the Maqam'at. And after this introduction, the Shaykh goes on to describe them one by one. After describing them one by one, their definitions and how they are acquired, he then talks about the nature of the self, the ego, and then he talks about the ahwal, those transient, temporary spiritual states that I've been mentioning, looking at those that arise as the person is developing the maqam'at. والله ورسوله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.